If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise.
A few years ago, me and 3 of my buddies went for what was supposed to be an overnight hiking and camping trip in the Smokies. After about 3 hours of hiking, we were just starting to set up camp for the night when a freak thunderstorm hit us out of nowhere. We scrambled to pack our stuff and miraculously managed to find a very small cave. Luckily, not big enough for any animals to be hiding in it. It was more of a rocky alcove that had just enough space to shield the 4 of us from the rain. We spent the night in the cave. One of my friends even started showing symptoms of hypothermia, but thankfully, I had an emergency blanket in my backpack that helped him. The next morning, we tried to find our way back to the trail. It took us 2 hours of hiking to realize we were very lost. One of the 3 friends I had with me was an Eagle Scout, so that was definitely a huge boon. Secondly, I had one of those huge hiker backpacks and packed everything in it that I would need for exactly this type of situation, including a big freezer bag full of pre-packaged food such as trail mix and protein bars. The Eagle Scout helped us ration that food out between the 4 of us. Mostly though, we got really lucky, since none of that would have mattered if we hadn't been able to find a source of water. Late into the first day, when we realized that we were lost, we found a small stream that had been created from the thunderstorm. We followed that over the 3 days until it eventually flowed into a creek, then a river. We followed that river downstream until we eventually reached civilization. That river was our biggest savior, since it provided us with a source of fresh water. We all had Enos, which are basically portable hammocks that you can easily set up between 2 trees, so we slept in those every night. It took us 3 days to find our way back to civilization. I was 8 years old, and I was on a camping holiday with 20 other children and leaders of a church. Our van broke down in a village about 11 p.m. While waiting for a recovery van, 2 of us wanted to use the public bathroom in the village. The lights were on in the public bathroom. As we walked towards the toilets, the lights started to flicker on and off, eventually staying off. We decided not to go in. Arriving at our destination in the early hours, we settled down for the next day. Later that evening, we were going to hike the local hills. It was getting dark and we were paired up and given torches. The 2 of us started to walk up the hill, and after 2 minutes walking, we noticed a strange shadow being about 60 yards ahead of us. We couldn't quite make out what it was, as our torch batteries were dying. It looked human in size, but we knew it wasn't human. We both screamed and ran back down the hill to our church leaders. We explained what we saw, but unfortunately no one believed us. I'm 32 now, and I have never forgotten that weekend. The best I can describe it as was a shadow person, but being honest, it could have been anything.
To understand my story, you sort of have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws in our country, and that we don't have any, so long as you're respectful and non-destructive. You can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing so long as once you leave the area, it is how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There was always yachts bobbing just off the shore with people in them and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this was the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in winter 2010, after picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift from me to me, as I paid her adoption fee. Now listen, I know many of you love dogs, and she will be very important to the story later on, so let me tell you a little bit about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dogfighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a Lurcher Staffy mix. She is a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most dogs, but you absolutely do not threaten her. She'll have you. So by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but as far as my family are concerned, dogs go on camping trips. So when we all piled into the car, she came too. Unusually though, none of my family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we left a bit later, we arrived at sunset. Not a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up, and the beach illuminated in campfires. The beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car, while they sat pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year and I wanted her to have air. As we're fumbling about in the dark, on a beach, in the middle of nowhere where it's pretty spooky, the one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big O shape if you felt like it. I wasn't really paying any attention to the road. I was complaining I was tired, as kids like to do, but my mom was. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, my mom's asking him had he seen that car drive around. It's been a few minutes. My dad kinda shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out there at this point, and I think my mom said it must be the security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down there to be nosy. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool, a junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches. Although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding onto the camping mallet and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried initially to be low-key with the guy and told him that was fine, we'd leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us, so my dad started shouting, and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad and possibly us once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put my dad and her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down. A bolt from the black, like a wolf descending on its prey, took us all by surprise, most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator large canines represent in nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in the arm she had got him by. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car, then drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. Quickly as we could, we gathered our things and all got back into the car, all pretty shook up by the incident. I looked Parmy over. She was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I'd left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her, as it was an old car and had the rolly down windows, not the electric button. We think she must have been able to hit it with her paws to force it down, enough to squeeze out. This is not the end of the story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided just to drive home so we could all feel safe, but first, we had to drive into the nearest town for gas, as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a gas station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to get a better look, and stuck his head out the window to get a better look at the sign. My mom asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. Never! My heart sank. Parked in the corner, behind a van so we hadn't seen him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bunt of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but it was far. The next town over was 60 miles away. He didn't have much gas, we realized, as we began driving. We were going to break down. That's fine, Dad said. We had AAA. They'd come tow us home, or at least to somewhere acceptable for the night, better than staying in that last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flashed from behind us. Another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him, following us. He must have realized we were low on gas. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us, but we weren't little kids. We were both in double digits. We knew how dangerous this situation was. Dad turned off the radio so we could hear if he sped up, and the man followed us for another 55 miles before he peeled away into another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a gas station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. Sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home. Just grateful nothing worse had happened than that. After getting some sleep, my mom called the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she had spoken to said they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. I have no idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then? Other than crazy man on the beach, let's not meet. Well, for me, it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled as one of my mom's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter where her mom and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home, she forgave, but never forgot. I think the saying is, I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. They have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. If you are able to, please adopt. You might find yourself in a situation like mine one day. I promise you, if you are willing to save a four-legged friend's life, they will pay you back tenfold if they are able to, without a thought for their own safety. I paid 78 euros for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid, but it chills me to my bones knowing that if I hadn't been so insistent on a dog, I might be dead.
This happened when I was around 9 to 10 years old. Growing up, my dad took us camping every summer vacation, usually leaving after Christmas. I'm from Australia. Christmas is in summer. Weird, I know. It was weirder for me when all the Christmas decorations had snow and winter themes, yet outside was 35 degrees Celsius plus, around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, around that time of year. It was so long ago that I don't really remember exactly where we went camping every year, but it was usually either near a creek or the beach. This year in particular was in a campground near a small creek. It was shallow and not strong, so it was good for us to crawl off in. There were quite a few campers, but not so many that we had limited space. This year there were only 6 of us. It was my dad, stepmom, uncle, auntie, cousin, and myself. My dad and stepmom shared a tent, as did my aunt and uncle, whilst me and my cousin shared another. Me and my cousin spent most of the day splashing around in the creek with some other random kids we met there. "What's that?" one of the boys we were playing with said suddenly. Let's call him Jono. Jono was pointing upstream and looking kind of cross between confused and worried. I looked in the direction he was pointing but couldn't quite see what he was talking about. "What the?" my cousin Ben started to say, trailing off at the end. He never finished the sentence because he seemed to panic and started running away. Being my older cousin, I followed blindly behind him with the other kids following suit. We were all in such a panic, we left our clothes and towels behind. Ben eventually slowed down as we neared our campsite. Dad saw all of us running towards the camp with fear on Ben's face and immediately asked us what was wrong. Once they had calmed down enough to speak, both Ben and Jono explained what they had seen at the creek. It took a while to get the story straight since they were both so shaken up. But the gist of the story is this. We were splashing around in the creek when Jono noticed some movement in the bushes next to the creek downstream. We all looked, but it was Ben who saw that it was a dirty-looking bearded man, dressed in camouflage tank top and shorts. It was hard to make out his age because his face was covered in dirt. What made Ben run so fast, mid-sentence, was the fact that the man was creeping up on us, trying to remain unseen. He was definitely coming for us too, because he was focused on Jono. My dad, after hearing this and getting the facts straight, grabbed the hatchet he used for wood and rushed down to the creek. Our things were still there, but our towels seemed to have been cut up by something sharp. Maybe a knife? I don't know. Dad grabbed all the stuff and escorted our newfound friends to their campsites and explained what happened to their parents. Afterwards, some of the adults went to tell the park keeper, and some of the men went in search of the man. Police were called, but the guy was never found. We ended up leaving early that trip, and me and my cousin just pitching a tent in Dad's backyard. We still went on camping trips after that, but the adults always made sure to be more vigilant. But we never went back to that particular campground, ever again. Until a couple of years back, I was really into solo camping. When I was younger, I used to go with my friends, but as we all got older, they all had their own plans and were really hard to pin down and all agree on the same date. So I ended up just giving up trying to organize. Problem was, I still wanted to go camping. I was the most into it in my group and had a heap of gear just going to waste. So I took the plunge and decided to try going solo. I was a little apprehensive at first, nervous even, but after my first trip I was hooked. I loved the freedom of going at the drop of a hat, doing what I wanted, when I wanted, without having to wait for the others. If I wanted to go after work on Friday, I went. If I wanted to hike early morning, I hiked. If I wanted to eat dinner a little earlier or later, I did. The freedom was intoxicating. I went as often as I wanted, and that was at least 2 times a month. The way I'd usually do it is I'd research parks where camping was allowed that weren't just packed campgrounds. I preferred to hike for at least a couple of hours to ensure I'd be surrounded by nature and with minimal people around me. Some of the places I camped were truly breathtaking. After having done this for some time, I had perfected my loadout. It was just enough gear for the weekend and light enough to hike out for some time. But I'm not here to talk about my gear and such. I'm here to talk about the last time I went solo camping. I arrived at the park around early afternoon after an hour or so drive. I parked the car in the parking area and got all my gear together. I then hiked for about 2 hours until I found a spot I was happy with. It was still late afternoon, so still plenty of light out as I set up my camp. After I pitched my small tent, I set about getting firewood for my campfire. When I was finally done, I got my fire started. Not a moment too soon either, as the sun was setting. I ate some food that I'd brought and settled in for the night, drinking whiskey from a flask I brought by the fire. Tired from the day's activities, I decided to get into my tent a little earlier than usual and read some until I drifted off. It wasn't long before I was sound asleep. I awoke suddenly to the sound of branches cracking and shuffling footsteps. I listened for a bit and tried to convince myself it was just an animal and to go back to sleep. But then I heard it. Similar sounds, but in a different direction. I strained my ears to hear better and could just make out that whatever it was coming towards my tent, but not just from one direction, but two. There were 2 sets of footsteps coming towards my tent from different directions and seemed to be making little to no effort to conceal themselves. What unnerved me even more was that they sounded bipedal. Whatever it was, I had to think fast. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. It was a gut instinct coupled with the fact that I saw no lights. Firstly, who would be creeping around this far out with no lights on? And secondly, why would there be 2, headed straight for my location from different directions? Something was definitely up, and I didn't want to find out what. I grabbed my pistol and whatever else that was important if I needed to escape in a hurry. I unzipped my tent as silently as possible and slipped out. I headed in the opposite direction to both of the footsteps. When I felt I was far enough away, I hid behind some bushes and watched my campsite. Whilst I did have a gun, I wasn't really the type to use it, let alone threaten others with it, unless I really had to. I only had it for extreme emergencies with wild animals. I never intended to use it on humans, which I now guessed was stalking my camp. I watched and waited for what seemed like an hour, but was probably more likely no more than 5 minutes. I then saw, in the dim moonlight mixed with the dying light of my campfire, a human-shaped shadow slowly appeared to the right of my tent. Not long after, it was joined by another on the left of it. It was too dark to make out exact details, but they both appeared to be carrying something heavy, maybe makeshift clubs. They paused and seemed to communicate with each other. Not sure if it was verbal or not. I was quite a distance away from them, so couldn't really hear, and they were obviously talking in low tones. Then, to my horror, they raised their clubs or whatever they were in relative unison and started bringing them down heavily on my once campsite. Again and again, where I had been sleeping not 10 minutes ago. I didn't need to watch. Their intentions were clear. I took off as fast and as quiet as I could. Luckily, they were making a lot of noise. I could hear them even as I ran. They eventually started hooting and hollering as they destroyed my tent with what they thought was me in it. I am so thankful for my keen sense of direction because I knew which way I had hiked from, even in the dark. I ran the whole way back to my car, or as much as I could, and walked briskly from time to time, but always resumed running when I could. I was back to my car in about 1 to 1.5 hours. When I finally saw it and reached the car park, I almost collapsed from relief. The adrenaline that had propelled me forward that whole time had crashed, and I was starting to shake. I made sure to get into my car and drive a distance away from the car park before I let myself rest. The shock of the situation finally hit me now that I was somewhat safe, and my eyes teared up and I was shaking all over. I was so close to having my life ended that night. The sun was just beginning to rise by the time I was in a coherent enough state, and I called the police to report it, who in turn contacted the park rangers. Even after patrolling the area, the two people were never found. So, that's the story of how solo camping almost ended my life.
This event happened to me last summer. It was probably the scariest story of my life, and I wanted to share it, so hopefully someone learns from it. Something I've realized growing up, year by year, is that this world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately, I've seen that side of our world firsthand. I'm a very social person, and I love the opportunity to hang with friends whenever. I'm also the type of person who's always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you I was a 17-year-old male at the time of the story, and have a decent-sized friend group of both boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy stuff together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane together before departing for college, and we all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. And by some miracle, all our parents thought it'd be fine. So we had 6 people going. Me and my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Braden and his girlfriend Kaylee, as well as Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple, for reasons you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware of everything we needed to survive for 3 days: food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for our fun getaway. So mid-July, we departed for our camping vacation. After hours of driving and driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded, but not too sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not too close. Again, we weren't looking for a sketchy woods to camp, but unfortunately, there was no service. It took us at least an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished setting up camp, Braden and I took a look around while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't too concerned because there were houses within a mile radius, and we assumed that those people had used this trail to hunt, which was big in this area, or animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's. It had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had eyes on the car at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt and drank a bit, then called it a night. The next day, we decided to explore the woods a bit, but Braden and Kaylee stayed behind to watch the site and spend time together. We decided to go down the path we found earlier. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity there. And no, not some voodoo or cult stuff, like flowers and notes being left. Beyond the cemetery was a bigger trail that had tire tracks and half of a parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer, then head back because it is getting late. That night we really partied hard because we were to leave the next day and didn't want to return the extra beer or weed. Now this night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful, and we assumed the same about this night as we began to turn in. Boy, were we wrong. Now you would assume there would have been warning signs earlier in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path or foot tracks around our site. No, not at all. All of us woke up to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent, as we hear the fabric being ripped by what we assumed to be something sharp. I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with his flashlight and was able to get him and Sarah to his car. Now here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car, while the other 2 tents are closer to the trail. So to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunkenness was gone, because before getting into his car, he yelled, "Cemetery," and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side of the cemetery. So I quickly grabbed Braden, Kaylee, and Stephanie and start running towards the trail. I used my phone flashlight to help me see. You might think, why would you turn your flashlight on? Well, the last thing I wanted to do was miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with the guy who attacked Steve. By the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had gotten out of the sight, and we could hear the guy chasing us, but from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily, and I hopped over the fence first. When we all get over the fence, we noticed Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid in the cemetery. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid in complete silence. My heart dropped when I heard the metallic shaking as if someone was climbing over the fence. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve yelled cemetery. We all stayed still as we heard the ground crunch as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight moments, you are capable of a lot more than you would think, and your brain is put on some super high alert mode or something. As the guy approached, I realized I had a small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket. As the guy's steps grew closer to me, and when he was right about on top of me, I grabbed my knife and lodged it into the back of his knee. The guy tumbled to the ground with a shriek of pain and a metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. Soon, a pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had made it. We all got up and ran to the car. When I got up, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had a look of pure hatred in his eye as he clutched the back of his knee. By his side was a huge machete. I was the last one to get in the car, and even before I fully closed the door, Steve floored it out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove until the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel or something. It was a friendly old couple. They told us there was not one for miles. They took us in, gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought his hunting rifle with us to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we got there was nothing stolen, but all our tents were slashed up. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone. When we got back, the officers were at their home and we gave our statements. The officers said there's not enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised a search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way home. We were all processing what really happened. The police unfortunately never found the guy. College has split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group, and it's been a year. My advice to all of you is, please find a populated place to camp. I don't care if it's some Yogi Bear camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, guys. Please.
Camping on the side of Chattooga River after a quick storm. We just hung hammocks on the side of a cliff to get some sleep, because we weren't going to make it to the designated camping spot. There was no more light. I would normally be happy with the above, but this was the first time I have ever had coyotes making crazy noises very close. I was in my hammock 2 inches off the ground, on the side of the cliff, hearing coyotes laugh like witches for the first time. I've never heard coyotes quite like that since either. Blair Witch was in my mind trying to go to sleep. At first light, we were happy to get going. Designated campsite was 20 minutes paddle down the river. Past a rapid, we were glad to not go down at night though. I'll never forget it. I think I might be able to take a coyote, but there was more than a few. I believe we camped next to a den, and they were not happy we were there. We all got a little bit of sleep, and the coyotes seemed to calm down eventually as well, mostly. I often think that if we had night vision game cameras, how many coyotes we would see walking around us at night though. About 12 years ago, my boyfriend, now ex, and I decided to go camping. I had always loved to camp, so I was really excited about it. We arrived well before dark and set up our tent about 2 miles into the park. We were fairly isolated, and there wasn't a lot of people camping as it was a weekday. We did all the typical camping stuff like eat, walk around, etc. Once it started to get dark, we made a fire and sat there, talking, while my boyfriend drank whiskey. There were a few times I felt as if someone was watching me, but I didn't see or hear anything. I felt uncomfortable and couldn't figure out why. We decided to get into the tent to get some sleep, and my boyfriend quickly passed out due to a large amount of whiskey. I, however, couldn't sleep. I still felt uncomfortable and as if I was being watched. I was laying on my side facing the door of the tent when suddenly a very intense feeling of dread and fear hit me. It was the strongest feeling of fear I've ever had in my life. Every hair on my body stood on end. There was a small window near the top of the tent, and it felt like if I looked at that window, something very bad would happen. It felt like I would die. I lay there, completely still, trying to listen to any kind of noise. At that point, I realized there wasn't any noise at all. The crickets that had been chirping constantly were now dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop at that moment. I remained as still as possible for what felt like an eternity. I was absolutely terrified and convinced I was about to be killed. The feeling of fear and dread continued to get worse. I very quietly started trying to wake my boyfriend, but he was out cold. I decided I had to get to somewhere safer than the tent. I slowly crawled over and got the car keys out of my boyfriend's pocket. I tried again to wake him up, and nothing. It felt as if my life depended on me getting out of that tent. I quickly unzipped the door and made a run for the car. As soon as I left the tent, it felt like someone was right behind me, but I didn't look back. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started bawling my eyes out while looking around. There was absolutely nothing there, but it was still dead silent, and I still felt as if I was going to die. I was so terrified. I stayed in the car with the doors locked all night, bawling my eyes out. The feeling of fear and dread started going away about an hour before sunrise, and sound came back, but no way was I getting out of that car. When my boyfriend finally woke up, I told him everything that happened, and he said, "It was just your imagination." That was the end of our relationship. I haven't been camping since this happened, and I'm not sure if I ever will again.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.